everybody. As promised, I am doing a quick screencast for our discussion of amphetamines for drugs and behavior. So let's go ahead and begin. So, what we're going to cover in this is the history and the development of amphetamines. We'll briefly talk about the pharmacology and the effects, and then an offshoot of amphetamines that are known as bath salts. Not to be confused with the actual bath salts that you put into the bathtub for a very soothing bath. So, here's a really brief history of amphetamines. So amphetamines are all synthetic. Generally, amphetamine is a parent compound. It is structurally similar to dopamine. So here is the actual chemical structure of dopamine right here. Now take a look at amphetamine. Pretty similar in this regard. Now if you look over here, this is ephedrine, which comes from the ephedra plant. And so ephedrine is actually based off of a plant. Here we have MDMA, which is ecstasy. We have a few other drugs that are typically used for laboratory purposes, MDA and MDE. Oops. We have cathinone, which is where bath salts come from. And then we have methamphetamine, which is meth. And so if you take a look at the chemical structure, really amphetamine and methamphetamine are not all that different. It's just that methamphetamine typically will have an additional group right here that makes it structurally more powerful than amphetamine is. Now, amphetamines will typically be divided into two major families. We have what is known as L-amphetamine or benzedrine and D-amphetamine, which are known as dexedrine. So occasionally you will hear amphetamines occasionally referred to as dexies or things like that because they do work off of dexedrine. So there are two different plants that have similar compounds to amphetamines. So I've already mentioned ephedrine from the Ephedra vulgaris plant. This has been an herb that has been used in Chinese medicine for thousands of years. It's been suggested that it's actually one of the world's oldest drugs. People would take ephedra and basically put it into a tea called ma huang. We have cathinone from Catha edulis, which is either referred to as cat or cat. That is an evergreen shrub that grows in East Africa as well as Arabia. You can actually see here is part of the cathinone plant here. So ephedra was originally used to actually be a treatment for asthma. And so the idea was that it dilates bronchial passages, so it opens up the airways. And generally, because this was being developed from a plant, supplies were incredibly limited. You could only make as many as would grow. So at that point, instead of using ephedrine, a synthetic was developed. So amphetamine was synthesized in 1887. It was basically designed to work like ephedrine. The inhaler was introduced in 1932, which utilized amphetamine, and it's also been used to treat things like narcolepsy. Now, one of the negative effects of introducing this inhaler, the original inhalers had a cotton ball that was soaked in the amphetamine, and people realized, hey, if you take that cotton ball out of the inhaler and you put it in your mouth, you're going to feel really, really good. And so obviously this led to problems and people ended up becoming very addicted to amphetamine as a result. One of the other things that we know, in addition to originally being used for respiratory medication, ephedrine was also used as a weight loss drug. And this was especially true in the 1980s and the 1990s. So when I was growing up as a kid, it really wasn't that uncommon to see advertisements for over the counter drugs like Dexatrim and Hydroxycut. And the reason that these were sold over the counter as a weight loss drug is because they were stimulants. And stimulants will often reduce your appetite. So generally, while you were taking something like Dexatrim, you would not really have much of an urge to eat. You wouldn't be hungry, and you would probably burn energy a lot more quickly because, well, stimulant. So one of the negatives behind ephedra was that it does elevate the blood pressure, and that does increase your risk of stroke or heart attack. So one of the things that we found, and this happened probably in the early 2000s, a really well-known baseball player ended up dying because of cardiovascular problem due to taking things like hydroxycut, which contained various quantities of ephedra. So at that point, in 2004, the Food and Drug Administration basically banned the sale of ephedrine in dietary supplements. So what you're looking at here is hydroxyslim. In this particular case, you can see it's with an ephedra extract. You are not allowed to have that anymore. So if you go to Walmart today and you try to look for something like hydroxycut or hydroxyslim, it will have compounds in it, but they won't be ephedrine. Ephedrine is no longer used in those compounds. Amphetamines were also utilized by the military and they were referred to as go pills. Typically, these were used to keep soldiers awake and alert. That's particularly so if they were flying planes in the Air Force for long flight missions. One of the things that we know is that because soldiers were being given these pills, some of them became addicted. And so, one of the things that we find is that in the military, usage of amphetamines grew after World War II and then peaked in the 1970s. Generally, we tend to find that if there are stimulants that are being used by the military these days, it's either going to be cocaine or meth. Do I think that the military is giving them cocaine and meth? Probably not. But I do have a feeling that if there are soldiers that are abusing stimulants, that is what they are abusing at this point. Additionally, like I said, pilots may potentially be given these amphetamines for long flight missions. And typically, we do find that occasionally truck drivers will use amphetamines or possibly meth or cocaine for similar reasons. So, now let's talk a little bit about the pharmacology and the effects of amphetamines. So, generally, we have some pretty common routes of administration here. Generally, they are taken orally, though they can be taken intravenously or through subcutaneous injection, which is referred to, as I talked about this week, skin popping. Generally, some of the street names that you will see for these include uppers, bennies for benzedrine, black beauties, dexies for dexedrine, or diet pills. Methamphetamine can, compared to all of the other drugs that are mentioned, meth can also, in addition to being taken orally or intravenously injected or subcutaneously injected, it can also be smoked or snorted. For meth, generally the common routes of administration will be oral, IV injection, snorting, or smoking. Generally, it's the latter methods, particularly snorting and smoking, that will create stronger effects, particularly on the central nervous system. And its street names include things like meth, speed, crank, zip, and go. Generally, if methamphetamine is in its hydrochloric crystallized form, that's going to be used for smoking, similarly to what we saw with the freebase and crack forms of cocaine. And in the 1980s and the 1990s, it was starting to become more popular to see that form used for smoking. Generally, it's going to be inexpensive, and because you are utilizing a smoking method, it is going to be highly addictive. Now, interestingly enough, I mentioned that when you're taking cocaine, that it's generally you will not see a physical dependence, but you will see occasional people become addicted and go on very long binges. So the same is true for people who are abusing amphetamines, and sometimes they're referred to as speed freaks. They're very similar in respect to heavy cocaine users. Generally, they will go on binges or runs of repeated injection. They will typically inject maybe every 2 hours or so. This can last for up to several days. I think probably one of the longest binges that was reported was a binge of 6 days. And generally, because these are hardcore stimulants, you typically won't need food and you won't need to sleep at that point. Generally, to kind of calm your system down, people will often apply barbiturates, tranquilizers, or depressants during or after the run to take some of that edge off before the next one. One of the other things that you can see, this can actually be combined with heroin, and they refer to that as a speedball. This is actually a cute little joke. Urban Decay sometimes has lipsticks with particularly inflammatory names, and this particular shade of lipstick, is actually known as Speedball. Amphetamines typically will work longer than cocaine. I mentioned that cocaine basically has a half life between 30 minutes and an hour and a half, which means that the drug can be completely cleared from your system between an hour and a half to 4.5 hours. Amphetamines are different. They tend to work longer and they tend to be metabolized by the liver at an incredibly slow rate. And compared to cocaine, they have a longer half life. That means that they are generally going to deliver longer lasting effects than cocaine, and they will also be in your system for longer. And what's interesting is that these drugs are what we call indirect agonists of the catecholamines. So, whereas with cocaine, we saw that cocaine basically blocks monoamine reuptake transporters and also blocks sodium channels, amphetamines are actually going to do something a little bit different. They are going to do two different things. First, they're going to increase dopamine release. So, what's going to happen is that the molecules of amphetamine will actually enter the nerve terminals and will start to release dopamine from their vesicles so that they can be released and increase that dopaminergic release. The other thing that's going to happen is that these dopamine transporters are going to pump in reverse. So instead of taking dopamine back into the cell, it's actually going to pump dopamine out of the cell. So both of these actions together will create a massive dopamine release in the synapse. So these are the two major mechanisms by which amphetamine works. Now, I mentioned that they affect the catecholamines. So if they affect dopamine, that means that they also affect norepinephrine. And they work in similar ways to dopamine. They cause release from vesicles and they cause reuptake transporters to pump in reverse. So what this means is that, again, we are going to see sympathomimetic effects. They are going to enhance the effects of norepinephrine. So typically, amphetamines will have the following side effects. You will see things like alertness, confidence, reduced fatigue. You're going to see a delay in sleep onset. And these people will be able to engage in sustained physical effort without the need for rest. Because it's operating on dopamine, these effects are going to be highly reinforcing. So these can have therapeutic uses. So we've already talked about a few that are technically legal uses. We also know that they are used as a treatment for narcolepsy as well as ADHD. Generally, we tend to find that whereas for most people, taking amphetamine can really amp them up, for people with ADHD, low doses will actually produce a very calming effect. Additionally, another type of amphetamine known as fenfluramine as well as phentermine or fen-phen back in the 90s was actually used as a treatment for obesity. And for most people, it worked really well. Unfortunately, we don't really use fen-phen today because of the side effects. Many people who took this drug reported heart problems and heart abnormalities. So its use was generally discontinued. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here and we will continue our discussion on the next step.